When people bring up how unfair it is that games cost different amounts in different nations, one of the first things others will respond with is the minimum wage. If the minimum wage is higher in Australia, for example, it makes sense that other prices would be higher, so it evens out. That's a chain of logic at least. And they're not entirely wrong, but they're using the wrong tool to measure this price differential. Basically, the minimum wage is being used as a proxy for purchase power parity, the amount of money it takes to buy an equivalent basket of goods across two nations. So you take the cost of stuff like housing, food, electronics, vehicles, and other major expenses, total them together, and then do the same for another nation. The two amounts should represent the same amount in quality of goods, so their difference is a difference in how much people will spend for it, and therefore how far their dollar or local currency stretches. This type of comparison has been irking economists since at least the 1910s, with discussions about returning to the gold standard following fiat currency use during World War I, asking about the real value of currency with printed unbacked fiat. When did too much become an issue? Simple exchange rates weren't that useful, since they were more affected by imports and exports than consumer transactions, and governments heavily intervened in order to secure more favorable trade deals. Following the shift to floating exchange rates during the Jamaica Accord of 1978, purchase power parity became more important, as imports and exports decide the exchange rate, but day-to-day consumer value was affected heavily by internal supplies and consumer preferences. In short, it meant that places with a weak exchange rate could have surprisingly strong standard of living, like China, while a strong exchange rate could have unusually expensive day-to-day goods, like in Denmark. So, economists sought goods that will follow the law of one price, the idea that a good should have the same price everywhere when all arbitrage is eliminated. For example, The Economist, starting in 1986, started using Big Macs. It made sense. Everywhere McDonald's is, they want their food to take up a pretty small amount of a person's food budget, so people will be willing to buy it. Since that's the only reason people will be willing to buy it. It needs to be above a minimum amount to be profitable, pay the workers and suppliers. So every McDonald's prices their Big Macs to take about the same amount of value in that region. Regardless of where you go, a Big Mac has about the same value, and McDonald's works extremely hard to price it to that local value. The issue was, while it is fairly accurate, 1 point isn't that stable, especially in food. While McDonald's will probably never run out of beef, it will definitely be more expensive if there's a drought, aggressive worker protections might mean that prices are higher in mostly developed nations, novelty might make prices higher in new locations, and so on. It's the same issue as using the price of cars as the only measure of inflation. There are too many confounding factors contributing to the price of the good. So they follow the same process as measuring inflation, from one good to a basket of comparable goods, which admittedly has its own issues, since the economists generating the data must choose what comparable means. And good luck finding a comparable good for American bacon in Pakistan. But it's better than just using hamburgers or the minimum wage. Now, the obvious question, how much does this matter? How much difference is there between using the minimum wage, the Big Mac index, and purchase power parity? Well, let's use the United States and Switzerland as examples. Here's the GDP, the minimum wage, the population, the GDP per person, the exchange rate, the Big Mac index, and the purchase power parity. Who is wealthier on a per capita basis? Well, obviously Switzerland. Chocolate, clocks, knives, and international banking are massively profitable industries with a strong amount of value added per capita. But how much worse off is the average American? Not nearly as bad as GDP per person would imply. Overall, adjusted on a purchase power parity basis, Americans generally do pretty well. Low cost of food, electronics, and other common goods tend to push the American standard of living higher, or at least roughly on par with the European counterparts. The Big Mac Index emphasizes Switzerland's more expensive food and other basic goods, which lowers their real standard of living. So, what's the overall conclusion? Basically, strong and weak currencies don't really matter on a day-to-day basis to the average person. What matters is how much a currency buys within that nation, and this can be generally found by taking the GDP per person and adjusting it to purchase power parity, which gives an idea of how much an individual in country A can purchase compared to an individual in country B. And in general, the more you can purchase, the higher your standard of living and the better off your life is. Now, back to the important piece. Video games and the prices between countries. Where is the worst and best place to buy video games? Brazil is the worst. Flat out, no question. Companies have refused to sell in Brazil rather than actually deal with the government. Due to local import laws, a knee-jerk response to immorality displayed in video games, and a largely failed attempt to create a national video game industry. But otherwise, here's a graph I generate using the regional price of COD World War II on the basis that Activision won't ever lower their prices on both Xbox and Steam. The points are the price based on the exchange rate, the Big Mac Index, and purchase power parity, ordered alphabetically. The worst country by purchase power parity? India, at equivalent of $220 on both Xbox and Steam. The best country? Sweden, at $24 on Xbox. Now, let's compare that to a naive currency exchange. The worst is Israel at $92 on Xbox. The best is Russia at $32 on Steam. And, just for hell of it, the Big Mac Index. The worst is Japan at $100 on both. The best is Russia at $38 on Steam. Overlaid, the graphs are pretty useful at explaining why currency exchange is a pretty bad measure. Nations with high amounts of exports appear much better than they actually are, like India. Similarly, the Big Mac Index prioritizes developed nations with secure supply chains and lower labor costs. It heavily penalizes developing and undeveloped nations, as well as developed nations with strong worker protections, like at Mexico and Denmark. So if you want video games, live in Sweden, and everyone should feel sorry for India.